in our agriculture lectures. This is the first one in a couple of different things. We're going to be looking at different kinds of practices in agriculture that go on today. We're going to be looking at mechanization, crop practices, irrigation, fertilizers, pest management, GMOs, and then the broad other category. I'm going to have this broken down into a couple of lectures so it hopefully doesn't be too tedious on you. I first want to make some clarifications about what we mean when we say traditional farming. When we talk about traditional, we're actually looking at the word industrial. And so the practices that we're going to be talking about here are essentially anything that came along after the advent of machinery and the heavy use of machinery. This really took off in the United States in the 1920s, moving forward to the present. In doing so, we saw a lot of changes that occurred that were environmentally kind of not so great. So we're gonna look at some of the pros to these things and some of the cons to these things. One of the pros in general is that we have been able to feed more people than ever before. So while Malthus talked about the limitations that we were going to have, it was always with agriculture. But he did not foresee what happened with some of these practices that we've seen and how we've been able to meet the needs of feeding people as our population has exponentially grown. There's lots and lots of cons, so we'll talk about those. We're going to contrast this with what's called sustainable or organic farming. Now, these practices, though they are sustainable and sort of seen as new, they're actually not new at all. Most of them are ancient practices. They've been going on for thousands of years. So it's sort of like we've been able to take a step back in time and look at how things work and what we can do better as we're moving forward. I've shared a bunch of different kinds of things with you, articles to look at in terms of how sustainability happens and what the big concerns are we have with this. So let's move on. All right, so the first category we're going to start with is mechanization. What is mechanization? It's a heavy reliance on machines. So just like it says, we're going to be using a lot of machines to do a lot of work. Now, what are some things that we know about this? Well, we know it works best on a large scale. So why is that true? Well, these machines are expensive and they get more and more expensive and sophisticated as time goes by. So if you think about the old plow or a tractor, you are sorely mistaken. These things are highly computerized. They're specialized. They're large pieces of equipment. They have GPS tracking on them. They can track moisture sensitivity. You name it, these machines are sophisticated enough to do it. So if you're going to use one, you have to get your money's worth. And the only way to do that is to work on a large scale for the most part. We also know that it works best when, and I'm going to do a lot of up and down arrows to show contrast, when you have high labor cost and low fossil fuel cost. So we know that here in the United States, we don't pay a lot for fossil fuels, and there's several reasons for that that we've addressed somewhat. So our fossil fuel costs are low enough that we can justify this. The problem, and also the way we look at it, is that we also insist on paying our laborers if we're doing things legally. And in order to do that, that means that our labor costs have gone up exponentially. So it doesn't pay to pay a lot of people if you can just have a machine that you can repair and fix and so forth and so on over time. So that's sort of the shift that occurred, and it kind of started in the 1920s when it went away, when it started to move away from the family farm and went, we can do it as a family, but we're going to do it on a bigger scale. And then ultimately, we can really do this industrially, right? So that you have a few number of people doing a vast amount of work. So let's kind of add that in. We have few people doing work, the work of growing, things we eat and things we wear. All right. What are the pros to mechanization? One is efficiency. So our efficiency goes up because we are essentially able to do more with a less amount of people, for one thing. All right, but the efficiency only works best if you are monocropping. So it requires monocropping. In other words, one crop at a time. If I'm trying to do more than that, I'm going to run into problems because I won't have the machines that I need in order to work more than one crop at a time. All right, what are the cons here? Why is this hard? Well, one is that these, like I said, these are expensive. So the cost of machines is high. And it's only getting more so. And a lot of that has to do with the sophistication of these machines. So think about your car, for example. Cars are getting more and more expensive. Now, the good news is they last longer, they're safer, all those things. But they also, we're requiring them to be more and more sophisticated for safety reasons and for efficiency and those kinds of things. Same works for this equipment as well. The other thing is that it can lead to soil degradation. And what we need, and we've looked at soil degradation, but mostly compaction is a problem here. So pushing the soil down is problematic. Also, we're burning fossil fuels, so we're going to see an increase in emissions. Right, so our emissions from fossil fuels is going to go up. And we're also seeing an increase in pollution. Pollution to air, water, the whole thing. Now, what's the difference between emissions and pollution? Remember, pollution, we think about emissions in terms of CO2, but it's greater than that. A lot of nitrous oxides and so forth are released in the running of machinery. And the more we run machines, the more pollution that we have into the atmosphere. How do we know it's a pollutant? It causes injury or problems for health. That's the main thing when it comes to pollution. It causes health issues. All right, so those are sort of the pros and cons there. It also does not work very well on a small scale, as we kind of contrasted there. Okay, so let's switching just a second. I'm going to switch over to a different color so you can see it a little bit better. Let's go with this blue right here. All right, so what are some things that people are considering doing when it comes to sustainability and getting the work done? So this really is about work, right? So obviously, you're going to see that there's going to be less reliance on machines. Well, the work still has to get done. So what are we looking for? We're looking to utilize human labor and animal labor. Okay, so, well, what about that? Because that means then that if my human labor is more expensive, aren't my prices going to go up? Absolutely, they absolutely are. But there's some payoffs here that kind of come into play as we go along. In terms of soil health, we talked about the degradation of the soil. We know that when we put animals to use in the fields, using things like their defecation and their urination, right? Those things can actually work in our favor. So returning nutrients to the soil through those kinds of things. And it's not just the urine and the feces. Also, they slobber a lot, and that helps put enzymes back into the soil. So they're discovering that if we allow animals to graze in places, that they can actually help to cut down our use of fertilizers. So it can lower fertilizer cost. It also can lessen soil degradation. So we have to pay for those things, and that can be kind of expensive. So we're going to cut those down. The other thing is that it's going to lower our emissions and pollution. So we get a win out of that. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that it works better on a small scale, right? So the work works best, and we could put that on the line, right? Like, it doesn't matter if it's a positive or a negative, it just works best on a small scale. Okay, so what are the cons here? Well, the main one is cost, right? So we're having to pay for human labor, but we're also having to take care of our animals in a better way, right? So it can actually drive cost up. It's less efficient, so I have to think through things a lot more carefully than I did before, in terms of how much I'm going to get out per acre, and this is problematic. And then that means that my productivity is going to go down. I'm going to have to accept the fact that I'm probably going to get less crops per acre, so my productivity drops. Now, on a positive, one of the things is that it can be humane, right? So we can see that, I'm going to add these down here. It can provide jobs, right? It also can be more humane for animals. Now, that's not necessarily the case, because if people don't take care of their animals, then it doesn't matter how many you have, it still can be bad. But if you take an approach that your animals are co-laborers with you, that they are valuable in what they provide for you, then you're going to make good choices. You're going to make much better choices if that's your mindset. From a negative standpoint, though, one of the things that can happen is that it can encourage illegal labor. All right, so we know that this has been problematic forever and ever, in terms of how we approach use of agriculture. And agriculture requires a lot of people. So I read that book that I read about the Dust Bowl days. So one of the first things, before they hated the Okies, they actually hated the Mexicans more. And the reason is they felt like the Mexicans were coming into California and taking over their jobs. Well, this has been a constant complaint in the state of Texas as well. However, trying to find people who will work in agriculture, especially on these small venues, is really challenging. Before, in the olden days, you had enough children to help you with that, right? So children, and my grandfather talks about, as soon as he was little enough to hold a sack on his shoulder, he was sent out to the cotton field. So children were seen as an asset when they got to be old enough to do some of the work, and then they went to work for the family. We've changed our mindset about that tremendously. So if your family's not going into work with you, then where are you going to find your labor? If we have to pay people, as we should, with the right kind of labor costs, then it's going to drive up your cost. If you want to skirt around things, then you'd hire people who will do it for cheap. And unfortunately, that can be illegal labor as well. So it doesn't necessarily follow that it will happen, but we have an immigrant problem. And this is something we'll talk about with human populations. Is this is not going to get better, people? This is actually going to become more and more problematic as we go. All right, let's talk about crop practices real quick. I say real quick, like I'm just going to run right through these, and you know that's not true. So, sorry. Okay. All right. Crop practices. What are we talking about? We're talking about how we go about taking care, essentially, of the soil. So, this is soil care. And how do we do that? We do that through our planting, through the way in which we manage the one big asset that we have, and that is the soil itself. The traditional approach, this from the 1920s, with machinery has been what's called tilling. And tilling essentially means turning over topsoil. So we know what's in topsoil, right? Topsoil is all the good stuff. It's the biotic and abiotic factors there. It's the nutrients. It's the humus, the decomposers are all there. Our burrowing animals, the tree roots, the whole 9 yards are all in that topsoil. When we till it, we turn it over. Well, why do we want to do that? And that's the question. All right, the other one is monocropping. And monocrops essentially mean planting one crop at a time. So what would happen was they would come in and their money crop, whatever it was, cotton, soybeans, they would plant it. And then whatever happened after that happened, right? But they were really looking toward that one money crop. So, or you could come in seasonally and plant something else, but you were still only planting one thing at a time. And that's the general gist of monocropping. All right, now what are the pros here? Why would you do this? So we're going to start with tilling first. Why tilling? Why would you turn over the topsoil? The main reason is they saw it as an effective way to kill weeds and insects. Well, how does that work? So what happens is that insects many times will throw there are species, right? So they will throw their eggs into the dirt, and then it sits there and they essentially start to grow over time. Usually they require water and time, right? Well, if you turn over the topsoil, they no longer are nested inside that topsoil. Same is true with the weeds. So we're talking about weeds that are going to disperse their seeds, they're going to land in the topsoil, and they're going to germinate, right? If I turn that over, those roots that were just starting to form in germination are going to dry out. And when they dry out, they die. So the thought was, if we do this and we kill everything, then what we need less of pesticides. So we're going to do this to decrease our use of pesticides. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? Like, why wouldn't you do that? Well, I found out that we need to take care of our topsoil. So it became then a trade-off. All right, so let's contrast that with then our, let's look at what's going on with monocropping. All right, so monocrops, why do you do that? Monocrops. Well, the reason is that it increases our efficiency. Always, 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 right? So I can get one machine and it'll come in there and do one thing. So if I need, for example, if I need to put down fertilizers, it's easy to do with monocrop. I'm only dealing with one thing, right? And I go in there and I spray it and they're all done. If I need to harvest, everything gets harvested at the same time. If I need to manage anything else in regards to weed killing or whatever, I know exactly what I'm doing with monocropping. So what this does is it increases efficiency. It also means I'm going to increase productivity. So I'm going to get more out by doing monocropping. It's easier done with machines, right? Easier with machines. Okay. Um, it also means that I can have a uniform, like I said, uniformity is really important. Uniformity of fertilizers, uniformity of planting, and uniformity of pesticides, right? So I know exactly what I'm doing, and I can go in there and I can do it very, very efficiently. Doesn't require a lot of people either, for the most part. All right, so what are the negatives here? Why am I going to look at this with some amount of concern? Well, when we look at tilling first, so let's make this just a little bit bigger. Tilling, what's wrong with it? Well, the big thing is that it degrades the soil. All right, so if we destroy our topsoil, we're in trouble. All right, so it degrades the soil. And how does it do that? Well, it dries it out. So now I'm losing my moisture that was being locked in, and with the humus and all that other and the roots and everything else, and now it's just there. It's drying out. What can that lead to? Well, drying out then can lead to erosion. Not just erosion of wind, but also erosion of water as well. So we have wind and water erosion that can occur. If it dries out, then what's going to happen? Well, that means that I'm going to have to increase my water usage. I've got to get water back in for the plants. So my water use is going to increase. Okay, which then means that my productivity is going to go down because I'm having now to balance this out, right? So my productivity dips. The other thing is that I'm losing organic matter, right? So my organic matter is decreasing dramatically. I'm now, I've tilled it up. It's going to blow away. I removed all the roots and everything. And now I've got nothing there to replace the nutrients that I had before. So I lose organic matter. Well, that's going to just mean then that I have to increase my fertilizer use, right? So that means I have to increase fertilizers. Okay. So those are the downsides. I hope you can see that don't look too great. All right. So what about on the monocrop end of things? Well, with monocropping, what are my downsides? One is that they become vulnerable to disease and pests. So if one thing comes in and eats it, everything gets eaten, right? So my diseases are gonna be problematic, and pests are also going to be problematic as well. Okay. It also is going to lead to erosion. So if I'm only planting one thing at a time and I'm not doing anything else, then my soil sits there vulnerable, right? So I don't have anything in between it. I have nothing. All I have is that one crop that I'm going to come in there and harvest and then leave the soil vulnerable. And that's going to lead to an increase in erosion. And then also, I'm probably going, because I'm not leaving anything behind, and I'm going to take everything out of it, I'm going to find that I'm going to have a decrease in organic material. And we talked about this before. Organic, we're going to use this word several different ways, right? So this is one way. When we talk about organics, we're going to contrast two different ways in which we're using it here. One is the actual organic material, or the humus, the decomposing material of the soil. Now, when we say organic, that means something specifically different. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that. Sustainable organic agriculture. You can have sustainable practices without touching organics at all. For example, you can still practice mechanization and not be organic, right? I can have a less reliance on machinery and still use pesticides and fertilizers. I can still do that. So what does organic mean exactly? Organic has a specific meaning when it comes to agriculture. Organic in agriculture means no pesticides, no commercial fertilizers, and finally, no GMOs. All right. Now, you can have sustainable practices and never have to worry about organic. Or you can do organic and still monocrop. Do you see? Like one doesn't necessarily follow the other. It's just that one specific thing says these are the things we will not use. We will not use pesticides, commercial fertilizers, and GMOs. Here's the tricky part of it. Just because something isn't certified as organic, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're using fertilizers and pesticides. There are a lot of sustainable practices going on that are not utilizing those things, or they're using a limited amount, and they're still not considered to be organic because organic has a certification to it. So you can't always tell whether something is truly organic or not truly organic, because it depends on whether the farmers are actually seeking that certification. And there are financial reasons for why they may not want to. So you can't always go by that. I think that's the big takeaway there. All right, let's look at some organic or sustainable. In this case, this is sustainable practices. It has nothing really to do with organic necessarily. All right, let me change my color here so you can see it. Let's go with this one. Okay, so what are we talking about with sustainable practices and our crop practices? One should be obvious, and that is no-till. All right, so we're not going to till the ground. My cousin, Jeff Posey, you can look his name up. He was president of the Cotton Board last year. He is a big proponent of no-till. He is a massive cotton grower. He's got cotton fields all over that he's managing for all kinds of landowners. But he has been practicing sustainable growing. Once again, he is not looking at how do we go organic. He's looking at how do we go sustainable, and that's kind of his big deal. He convinced a lot of people out there in West Texas that no-till really was the way to go. Well, they'd all been tilling, and they looked at him and were like, "What are you doing?" No, we till. We don't want to use we don't want to use pesticides, so we're going to till. And they started looking at what can we do instead? How can we do this so that we're not losing the topsoil like we had been? So what is no-till? It is essentially leaving topsoil intact. Once again, if your goal is to use the soil to the best of your ability, if you're there to make sure that your one valuable commodity, the soil itself, is healthy, then you're going to think about, how do I save my topsoil? That becomes almost a given, right? That's what you want to do. So what do? They essentially come in, they might cut off the tops of the cotton, for example, right? So they come in and they do what's called stripping. They essentially have a machine that slurps up all of the tops of the cotton. It takes the bolls, the open bolls, and the fibers themselves. It takes the seeds, and it also takes all of the leaves and stems and the little shoots that hold the boll together. It takes it all, and then it sends it to the gin. And at the gin, it goes through a separating process. So they pull the top off, but then they leave the roots in the ground. So you have these little sticks out there, but underneath, all the roots are still there holding the topsoil in place. So that's what they do with no-till in that particular case. Another practice is called intercropping. Now with intercropping, basically what you're doing is you're planting a row of something and then a row of something else. So let's say we have our little field out here, and we want to grow some red cabbage because I got a little red. So we'd plant our red cabbage right here, right? And we may move over, maybe we do 3 rows of red cabbage, right? And then in between, we're going to plant something else. So we're going to change it to where we'll grow, I don't know, soybeans, right? So in between, we've got our little soybean plants growing out here. So this is a kind of way in which you do intercropping. All right. Now there's several different ways to go about doing this. You might plant like strips like I show here, or it might be 4 or 5 plants all planted next to each other. But they essentially are grown there, and most of the time they're complementary to each other. So you want to grow things that have similar soil needs, but they have their own specific take on things. And I'll kind of explain that a little bit here in just a second. All right, so there's intercropping. Another one is called agroforestry. So what's that about? It's essentially growing crops underneath trees, right? So I have my trees. So I'm gonna put some trees out here real quick. Sorry, these are awful looking, but there you have it. All right, so I'm going to plant those. I'm going to put some leaves on them because I don't like it looking like that. So I'm going to put my leaves up here on my trees. Maybe these are pecans. Maybe it's a pecan grove. I don't know. Something I'm growing. I've got a crop up there. So let's say it is pecans. I've got my crop growing up there, but underneath I'm going to grow something else. I don't know. I'm going to grow that. Maybe it's some blueberries, right? So I'm going to take and I'm going to grow my blueberries up underneath. So I'm going to put my little blueberries there. Now why would I want to do that? Well, for one thing, I would get more efficiency on the ground. I wouldn't want to put something between there that I have to come in there and do a lot of manual harvest or harvesting with machinery, because that might actually do damage to the tree roots. So I would want to put something in there that's not quite so damaging. And I think blueberries work well because they go on a bush and you go in there and you pick them off. So there's my idea. All right, another practice is called crop rotation. And crop rotation can be done on an annual basis, meaning every year you could do it, or it could be done seasonally. So usually what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll plant their money crop, let's say it's cotton, and then they're going to come back in the wintertime. So that's a summer crop, and then they're going to come back in the wintertime and they're going to plant wheat or alfalfa or something else. Now they also can harvest that as well, so they get 2 crops from those 2 seasons. Or it could be done so that one year I plant one thing and then the next year I come back with something else. So it all depends on what they decide they're growing and for what the purposes of those is. And then the other one is cover crop. There's a couple more besides that. All right, so cover crop. And what the cover crop does essentially is I plant it in between my money crop, and the whole goal is to keep the ground covered, just like it says. Now, a couple of examples that my cousin has used, keep the ground covered. One is 1 year, I know at least 1 year, they've planted radishes in the winter month because they grow very well in cold weather. So I said, why did you plant radishes? And he told me, he said, the root, and we usually think about a radish being like this big, those roots get to be like a foot tall, 2 feet, and they get really big. They have leaves across the top, broad leaves that are taking in water and moisture, and then so is that root. So that root takes in all this moisture and holds it and locks it in. But they don't harvest it. They let it decay. So they let it go in the ground, and what it does when it decays is it starts to release all of that water that it had been holding onto in the winter months, and now they have it in the spring when they have to come in there and plant. So he's a dry land farmer. That means he doesn't irrigate at all. So this was a good way for them to come back and use the very essence of that plant and put water back into the soil. I thought whoever came up with that idea was a genius. Now, another cover crop is something called legumes. And legumes essentially are things like peanuts, soybean, anything that has a bean pod is a legume. And they are marvelous because they also house nitrogen fixing bacteria. So they're able to actually put the nitrogen back into the soil, and that's pretty cool. All right, and then the other practice here is called ground fallow. And ground fallow simply means that we let the land rest. They can do this in several different ways. So let's say you have a plot of land and you divide it into 4. Maybe one year I plant in 1 and 3 and 4, and I let 2 rest. Then another year maybe I plant in 2, 4 and 1 and 3, and I let 1 rest. So I can take a turn at doing this. Now, what this does is it allows the nutrients and the organic material to go back into the ground that we had taken from all that time, right? This is an ancient practice, y'all. It's actually mentioned in the Bible. So they did ground fallowing in what was called the year of Jubilee, although they were never really able to let it go. They tried, and that was a directive from God that said, let the land rest for, every 7 years. It's hard to have ground and let it rest. I remember when I was a kid, my grandfather just couldn't stand it when they told him he couldn't plant on his land. He's like, it's my land, I'll plant if I want to. He actually talked like this. It's my land, I'll plant if I want to. And they were like, well, no, we're going to pay you not to do that. And it's really hard to wrap your mind around not using the land. But the key here is to let it rest so that it's productive again, right? So it's a different mindset. It's a different way of looking at things. All right, so what are the pros and cons here? Are the pros, let's talk about those first. I'm going to change my ink again. Let's go with this color. All right, so my pros. With my cover crop, well, it replenishes nutrients, right? So that increases my productivity. In fact, all of these are going to help increase productivity. The other thing is that it lessens erosion because I'm keeping my ground covered. That should be obvious, but it lessens erosion. And that's going to lead to less runoff. So we're going to decrease runoff, which means that I'm not going to get fertilizers down into the water supply. I'm going to be able to hold it intact if I'm able to do that. What are some typical cover crops? You want something that's got a lot of nitrogen in it. So some typical ones are things like soy. I'll mention the radishes again. Anything that's cruciferous like broccoli, they're using a lot of. And alfalfa. And also clover. And the reasons why they really like a lot of these is that they are nitrogen fixing plants. Actually, the bacteria inside the little legume is the nitrogen fixer. So it returns the nitrogen to the soil, right? So it increases your nutrients. Also, you can cut those down and still leave the roots and everything in the soil. You can then use them also for animal fodder. And so that's a really good thing with it. All right, with our intercropping agroforestry, okay, I'm going to put those, kind of lump those together because they all do the same thing. The main reason why you want to do this is that it gives homes, provides homes for beneficials. All right, now what does that mean? Well, a beneficial essentially is the predator-prey relationship. So this calls on your predator-prey. So if you have a place where, let's say, ladybugs like to live, right? Why would you want ladybugs? Well, the ladybugs are going to help control things like aphids, right? So you have a beneficial insect, being the ladybug. You give it a place to live, you give it all the things that it needs, and then it's going to do your work for you. Why do you want to do that? Well, because that means you're going to use less pesticides. Now, it doesn't say no pesticides, it says less pesticides. So once again, we're looking at sustainable practices. Some are organic practices, but not necessarily all organic practices. And when we do this, it also means we're going to use less fertilizers, right? This whole thing uses less fertilizers, which then means that I'm going to also have less erosion because I'm keeping my ground covered. I'm taking care of my topsoil. And then it also means that if I plant more than one crop, well, I'm going to have less disease. So if I lose one, no big deal. I've got others to fall back on, and less pesticides or pests, right? So all of these are win-win. My cousin practices all of these. He is not an organic farmer, but he practices these techniques. So all of them are going to help to take care of the soil, the number one thing that you have. All right. Are there downsides to this? Well, of course there are, because you know how things are in environmental science. That means that if we have one good thing, we're probably going to have something that's not so great. All right. The problem with no-till is that it can lead to an increase in pests. All right. In order to treat those pests, whether it be weeds or insects, it means my labor costs are going to go up. With intercrop or agroforestry, it means that my productivity is less, right? Because I can't get the heavy machinery in there to do the one thing. So you have to plan out very carefully how you're going to do it. Went to a winery one time in Chile, and they showed us that at the edge of every row, they had rose bushes planted. Why did they do that? They did that so that it housed the beneficials that they needed. It also explains why lavender fields are becoming really popular in wine country. And that's so that we work together to use less pesticides and use the natural world to help us to do the things we need to do. Unfortunately, it also can lead to lower efficiency, but you have to, I think they're working on how do we get better at this? Even on industrial scales, how do we do it? And then it's also going to increase our cost. It can increase costs, right? Especially if I'm getting less out of acreage than I intended. For example, the ground fallowing can definitely be a time where you're going to have less there than before. All right, that's all lecture 1. I hope that this helped you in big ways. Bye.